Sundhya is one of the best known and most read international law scholars, and her research has fundamentally shaped the field of international law, in particular with regards to the relationship between global North and South countries. Her seminal book, Decolonizing International Law, honored by the American Society of International Law, has been foundational in the academic formation of a whole generation of scholars, including me. Sundhya's research focuses on the history, theory, and practice of international law in historical context and is characterized by masterfully connecting diverse disciplinary traditions, ranging from philosophy and history to political economy and literary studies. She is currently directing the program on global corporations and international law, a 5-year research project funded by an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellowship, directed toward understanding, interrogating, and reconceptualizing the relationship between global corporations, states, and international law. Sundhya is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Social Sciences, and from 2016 to 2023 was the director of Melbourne Law School's Institute for International Law and the Humanities. Sundhya is also global faculty member of the Harvard Institute for Global Law and Policy and has served as director of studies in public international law at the Hague Academy of International Law. The list of her achievement goes on to impressive length and includes her senior advisory role to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the Level Hume Visiting Chair to Cambridge, the Max Planck Cambridge Prize for International Law, the Janus Chair at Osgoode Hall in Toronto, and visiting chairs at the National University of Singapore and the Graduate Institute in Geneva, as well as a Fulbright Senior Fellow Award to Harvard. You get the gist of the thing, right? Most importantly, however, Sundhya is known for her explicit dedication to academic citizenship. She created the Academy of Transnational Legal Scholarship, hosting an annual virtual intensive program for doctoral and early career researchers in law that some in this room have already had a chance to participate in. Having had the great luck of being supervised by Sundhya in my own PhD, and having been trained in the Melbourne School of Jurisprudential Thought and the Melbourne School of Conduct of the Office of an Academic, I can say that it's the unique combination of generosity, joy, brilliance, wit, and warmth that makes every engagement with Sundhya and her scholarship uplifting and always leaving you wanting more. Thus, I am excited and grateful to be able to host her here in Amsterdam. This is, however, largely owed to the efforts of my colleague Jean Guadou and the Laureate team from Melbourne, who successfully secured a grant from the research priority area Decolonial Futures of the University of Amsterdam, and who has done a fantastic job in organizing Sundhya's visit and the two workshops accompanying today's lecture. I will hand it to you, Jean-Gua, to say a bit more about the grant and about today's lecture.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Andrea. I'm very happy to be here today. My name is Zhonghua, and I am currently finishing my PhD at UVA, so it's very nice to be able to do this when I'm still in UVA. I have the fortune to visit the Laureate program at Melbourne 1.5 years ago when my connection with Eileen and Andre really started. And last year when we applied for the seed grant, we really didn't thought it would be such a wonderful gathering of people. Our expectations are really exceeded by all means today. And we also have the brilliant company by Sundhya, always so attentive to every speaker's presentations, asking such brilliant questions and provoking us to think about the question of global cooperations and international law. So today we will have Sundhya speak for about an hour, and then we will open the floor for questions. For the people online, if you have questions, please be prepared. We will be reading your questions from the meeting chat. And if you have the questions, please do so. Welcome, Sundhya.
Thank you. Okay. The problem with such incredibly generous introductions is that the only way from here is down. So sometimes I don't recognize myself in those introductions, but in any case, thank you so much. My brilliant youngsters, as I call you. I feel a little bit old now that I've shaped a generation. That's okay, I'll take the compliment. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Andrea and Jean-Hua for being so facilitative of this visit, the University of Amsterdam, the ACIL, the Decolonial Futures Research Group. I've forgotten all the acronyms. And I'd also really like to thank Yilin Wong and Andre Dow, who have co-organised the workshop that we've been in for the last day and a half. It's really been a great pleasure to learn from those of you in this room who have been giving papers already. So often today the future looks bleak, but spending time with younger scholars is one way to part the dark clouds on the horizon. So I am also honoured to be part of the Decolonial Futures lecture series because I really share the commitment of that group to trying to understand the ways in which coloniality operated. Sorry, I'll just put this timer on. Coloniality operated as a form of power and to address its legacies in the present. So in this lecture, I am going to be a fool and talk to Dutch people about the VOC, but I want to join the mission of the Decolonial Futures Project and the purposes of ACIL and the themes of the conference by revisiting Hugo Grotius and asking what he can help us to see about how the techniques of international law tend to pattern and repattern the world in particular ways. So it's a longish lecture, so if you want to shift about a bit, please do, but that's okay. Hopefully I'll hold your attention. But because I am interested in history in order to really see what it can tell us about the present, I want to begin not immediately with our friend Hugo Grotius, but with, slide. It did work a second ago. Technology, can never rely on it. Now my big reveal is wasted. It worked a second ago.
The ghost in the old VOC room.
Yeah. No, it's coming from that one. We've got so many. One's the microphone, one's the camera, one's the slide. Yay! Okay, so I want to start not with Hugo Grotius, but with Mark Carney, who you will all recognise as the Prime Minister of Canada and a former central banker. So I'm sure you'll all know that on the 20th of January, Mark Carney gave an address at Davos at the World Economic Forum. And the WEF, World Economic Forum, is an event which brings heads of state together with heads of global corporations and gives those and investment firms and gives those guys unsurpassed access to world leaders. So at that gathering, Carney gave a speech in which he announced a rupture in the world order, the end, and I quote, the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality, where geopolitics among the great powers is not subject to any constraints. According to Carney, it was time for the middle powers to stop going along to get along and no longer stay quiet to avoid trouble. The message of the present for him is to stop pretending that the world today is what it was. Nostalgia is not a strategy, he said. And he called upon the audience explicitly in his speech, companies and countries, to stop participating in rituals that they know to be false, and specifically to stop pretending that there is any longer a rules-based international order which can bind the strongest. His solution is for countries to strengthen their domestic economies, diversify their trade relations, to enter into defence alliances that recognise that the United States has become a threat, not a friend, and to stand taller and to reassert the lesson that law and morality have always been a middle-class concern. So the middle powers should get together and wield the levers of legitimacy, integrity, and rules, and together live in truth to offer moral and legal leadership to the world. The speech garnered a standing ovation from the leaders of the companies and countries in the audience. And while I strongly agree that world leaders, including my own Australian Prime Minister, should stop toadying to Donald Trump, I want to draw our attention to a few things about that speech and its reception that are heuristic for us today. Perhaps the most striking thing about the speech is its short temporal horizon, its delivery at the WEF to an audience of corporate leaders and state leaders, and the fact that Carney was implicitly reasserting moral authority and the source of that moral authority and the source of legality should remain in the hands of the West. This time, though, not in the hands of the great powers, but in the hands of the middle powers. The king is dead, long live the prince. So, in his invocation of what international law was, though, Carney discounts the experience of the South. So, despite the fact that the South has almost never experienced international law as a restraint on power, this was not relevant to Carney's idea of what knowledge or experience to draw on. Through his performance, we're reminded that Western international legal discourse, in my argument, can't take the experience of the South seriously and still hold on to an idea of lawful life. This is because taking that experience seriously would pose a challenge to the moral authority of the West, which grounds the legal authority of the West. So this puzzle of how the West maintains its moral authority and continues to assert its ability to decide for all what law is, even as we stand in the planetary wreckage of its making, is part of the puzzle that I want to think about today. The other part is to join that puzzle with the observation that a handful of large global corporations are setting the rules for the planet without accountability and without responsibility. And at the same time, a tiny group of trillionaires are at the helm, being enriched beyond imagination, devouring the planet and immiserating a never-increasing proportion of the people of the world. So in my argument, the authority question and the material question, as I'm going to shorthand them, are linked. European international law is implicated in producing this situation, but also in obscuring its own implication through its disciplinary routines. Because it is patterned into the same routines through training and habit, it has proven unable to find meaningful ways out of it. At the same time, possible ways forward, particularly coming from the global South, are being displaced by the way that European international law continues to assert its own moral and legal authority as law for all the world. So today, I want to suggest that this is part of a very long pattern. And in fact, you might even call it a Grotian pattern, but not as you might know that. So people use the idea, oh, I forgot to show you that slide, truly horrifying, but just the figures underneath are also like net worth. What does that even say? $788 billion. Net worth, 105.3 billion. I mean, it's just insane. Okay, so people often use the idea of a Grotian moment to describe the bringing of law to a lawless situation. But I want to suggest that it would be more accurate to describe a Grotian moment as a moment in which the extraterritorial expansion of European laws happens through the export to the South of an intra-European dispute and the prefigurative displacement of rival laws through a joinder between company and state. This displacement is later actualized through imperial assertions which ground that authority in the earlier moment through disciplinary historiographies and routines which reinscribe virtue uniquely to European law, all the while underpinning that claim with violence. So, in other words, the Grotian moment is not only contemporaneous with Grotius. He didn't make his own moment. That was made retrospectively in the 19th century. So the Grotian moment is about both the older techniques and the later ones at the same time. So this has implications for how we should do international law as scholars, as teachers, as practitioners, as activists, both if we want to take responsibility for what we are doing when we do international law, but also if we want to disrupt the pull of the particular futures emerging out of that old pattern. So in the first part of this lecture, I want to think about what Grotius was doing and how he was doing it. And I don't want to engage in any moral evaluation of Grotius' activity, but hold us at the level of description. As a matter of method, I want to ask what he was up to as a question of technique. I'll then very briefly consider the actualization in the 19th century of what was prefigured and the erasure of the company-state relation through disciplinary routines, including historiographical ones. And I'll conclude by opening a discussion about the methods that this talk is performing and open the floor to all of us to think about what that means for how we should do what we do and how particular methods might help us think better about decolonial futures. Okay, so having declared my presentist position and told you that I'm the fool who rushes in where angels fear to tread by talking about Hugo Grotius in this room, let me now jump recklessly back into the past. So I'm not a Grotius scholar. I can't read any of the original documents in Latin or Dutch, so I'm shamelessly standing on the shoulders of giants. But I'm bringing what I think is a slightly different set of questions to that work and maybe a slightly different orientation to the materials. So, I'm one slide behind myself. Sorry, that was, what have I done? Okay. Sorry, that was the outline of the lecture that I mentioned, part 1, 2, and 3. Part 1 is the longest, so don't worry. So as we all know, Hugo Grotius was born in 1583, and at the tender age of 21, he was commissioned to write a text that would later be mythologized as one of the founding texts of the discipline of international law. I think even the European Research Council would have to concede that that is impact. The text was commissioned by the VOC in about 1604 and was meant to defend the actions taken in 1603 by Grotius's cousin, Admiral Jacob van Heemskerk, who, on a voyage funded by the newly formed VOC, when he was the captain of the ship, seized the Santa Catarina, that was a Portuguese merchant vessel laden with goods from Macancha. Okay, you all know that. The ship and its cargo of porcelain, silk, and copper were taken back to Europe and caused a sensation. The cargo was worth a huge sum of money by any standard, and its sale opened the eyes of merchants in Europe to the profits that could be reaped from trade in the Indies. The dispute was adjudicated by the Amsterdam Admiralty Board on the basis of an eclectic mixture of arguments who declared the cargo good price. Grotius's text was written later. I suspect most of you know this already, and Vonitissum says that the text can be read as a response to the decision and as an apologia, but also as an attempt by Captain von Heemskerk to have Grotius put some order into the tangle of principles and perhaps to set the terms for the future activities of the VOC. The dispute was, of course, an intra-European dispute between Dutch and Portuguese merchants. But according to Grotius, the King of Johor sought the assistance of van Heemskerk to repel the Portuguese forces. Now, drawing on Peter Boschberg's work, it seems that what truth in how this unfolded in that place is not clear, but what are true are two things. First, that the Santa Catarina and its riches were taken back to Europe, and secondly, that an extra version of European law was made to sustain an argument that the King of Johor was sovereign and capable of treating with the VOC. Now, contemporary international lawyers often contrast this favourably with the arguments made by the Portuguese scholar, de Freitas, which hinge on discovery and occupation. Grotius's arguments, on the other hand, were affirmed on the basis that the king was being recognised as sovereign, and therefore Grotius is a proto-cosmopolitan because he is making arguments about treating with non-Christians. But this misses the fundamental point that it's not about good guy, bad guy Grotius. It's that both sides of that argument are asserting the authority of European law to govern in that place, not the laws of the place, nor seeing an encounter between rival laws of encounter or practices of diplomacy in operation in that place. At the time, though, these arguments were relevant as between Portugal and the Dutch, but didn't have much effect in Asia. In quite a few papers we have heard during this conference, including Faye, I don't know if Faye's here, including Faye's paper, Faye de Jong, emphasised that the European texts in the VOC were not really regarded as particularly important during the 17th century by, let's call them the Asians. The King of Johor didn't seek recognition. He didn't regard the treaties as doing the work that the Dutch said they were doing. So although it was not so relevant to the non-Europeans, though, I just want to notice that this is the first technique I'm drawing our attention to, because it's one we will see return again and again in international law, which is to make the argument that the defence of the South is a justification for European violence and for the asserted basis of its authority. We can see it everywhere, from the Berlin Conference and the idea that the justification of slavery gives an obligation to Europe to carve up Africa. We can see it in women's rights as a justification for the invasion of Iraq. We can see it in relation to Iran, the idea of liberating the people. We can see it in the Board of Peace. So that move of the justification for the assertion of European authority in the name of the protection of the people of the South. But unlike the instances of this which happen after the 19th century, where cause and effect are compressed in time, here the asserted authority over non-Europe is being prefigured and not actualised. That's why it's relevant that the Asians didn't really care. But the ex post facto timing of Grotius's text, as being written after the dispute was already resolved, can help us to understand what work Grotius's text might have been doing in another respect. Let's consider the context. So at the time Grotius was writing, in this place, people were organising themselves in a vast plurality of groups. These groups included families, towns, companies, clans, guilds, ethno-religious communities. And although we constantly speak of that time as being affected by wars of religion, in fact, according to critical historians of religion like Brent Nongbury, religion per se had not yet been invented as a separate category or classification or designation. This gesture of classification, ascriptive classification, happens as part of the claim to authority by what was emerging as the state, which Grotius himself was part of, but I'll come to that. But what we think of today as people's religions reduces a much more holistic situation, which encompasses rival forms of life and rival forms of law, but which get redescribed through this ascriptive classification of religion. All of this is to say it's a time of great and obvious legal plurality, which we don't see retrospectively because we have now come to redescribe so much law, particularly non-European law, as religion. The relationship between the groups is also important, though, because there was no government or superior authority. There was a powerful urban regent patriciate based in corporate bodies such as town councils, provincial states, companies, and there were also weak rulers, pretenders, Habsburgs, delegates, emissaries of France and England, as well as local provincial stadtholders, often drawn from the House of Orange. So there was a plurality of forms of life and law and different ways that people, place, and authority were joined together. And people were generally resisting the attempts by others to govern them. But there were attempts being made to do just that. And one of the drivers for those who wanted to assert their authority over other people, surprise, surprise, was to gain wealth. So, according to the historical sociologist Julia Adams, this happened largely through family networks. So, she has redescribed what Weber called the patrimonial state as the familial state. And she describes it particularly through questions of gender as well. And I'm persuaded by her account, except that I would like to highlight the importance of the corporate form and maybe shorthand the networks she's talking about as company family groups. So, what the company family elites were trying to do was enhance their control over what Adams describes as the conditions of making money and over economic affairs generally. But another way of saying this is that they wanted to control lawmaking to enhance wealth production. But law itself, as we understand it today, as an emanation of the state, did not exist. So, creating the conditions for making money did not entail capturing existing institutions and laws, but creating them. And not only inventing and creating them, but claiming the authority to create them and to bind other people to them. What this meant was that if those groups could make rules, create patterns, and institute forms of relation that took hold about what we would only later come to take for granted as property, contract, ownership, transfer, inheritance, trade, monopoly, taxation, enforcement, even currency, both inside and outside the nation republic, they could accumulate more wealth. So one strategy that they used to do this was to proffer and seek officers in the emerging idiom of stat. This included Grotius too, who was embedded in the family company networks of power. I already told you the other guy, Bunheemskirk, was his cousin. He was deeply embedded in the VOC and he held various offices of state through family influence, what would emerge as the state. These strategies entailed multiple techniques of jurisdictional assertion. So at the same time as being involved in the creation and occupation of patrimonial offices and privileges, these guys had to produce the cultural knowledge that invoked the symbolism of rightful rule. And at the time, the idiom of rightful rule that is emerging is our old friend sovereignty. So they had to capture that idiom and marshal it toward locating that sovereignty at the putatively of rightful rule at the nexus of family, company, and state. So, for example, Julia Adams talks about the commissioning of political poetry for this purpose. But what I'm suggesting is we can read Grotius not as a political poet, but Grotius writing after the dispute in the same way, writing not poetry but political philosophy or theory which related rightful rule to particular groups of people, and he was a publicist writing for a public audience. So this is a good way to understand the idea, note to method, of the way in which theory is always also practice. More specifically, I would call this type of practice prefigurative. So in my argument, Grotius was specifically writing prefigurative jurisprudence. But I want to pause here to say something about prefiguration, because this is an idea with at least two valencies. On one level, prefiguration is an idea that you're probably familiar with, where it's the idea of describing that which you wish to come into being, describing it as already existing. This is a usage that might be familiar to this audience because it's a term taken up in the 1970s by the radical left in Anglo-America and used more recently by anarchist theorists like David Graeber, by feminist thinkers like Margaret Davies and Davina Cooper, and by alt economy thinkers like Amy Cohen and Bronwyn Morgan. And they are precisely using the term to suggest an idea of the need for transformative social movements to use prefigurative legality in the case of Morgan and Cohen to adapt the ways and means of the hoped-for society. But on the other hand, prefiguration is a Christian exegetical or interpretational tradition which is a recursive temporal framing. in which something is later interpreted as having already anticipated what was to come, and so to authorize that as part of a single story. So this, for example, is how the Hebrew Bible gets rechristened as the Old Testament. So instead of it being a different tradition, it's re-narrated as part of the same tradition. So the universalizing move of saying what it was doing was prefiguring the arrival of Christ. So it has an account of predestination, which authorizes the thing that is said to come, and it's rendered into a universal story instead of a rival one with its own temporality, right? I hope you get that, what I mean by that. But in both senses, the prefigurative becomes particularly powerful when we combine it with training in forms of life and techniques of knowledge production, institution creation, and education. And this is going to become important retrospectively for Grotius too. But in contemporaneous terms, it is of a piece with the other act of prefiguration and institution formation we need to attend to, the Charter of the VOC. So again, many people in this room will know far better than me that the VOC comes into being as a merger between 6 groups. There's competition between those, what historians call pre-companies, but anyway, leave that aside. Lowering prices in Dutch markets, raising prices in Asian markets because they're competing. Dutch and English merchants want a share of the direct trade in Asia. Portuguese were dominating that trade with respect to Europe, but until 1800 or so, trade outside Europe was dominated by, anachronistically, India and China. Everything's in quotation marks, not the Europeans. But those 6 groups, as well as having commercial ambitions, also had political ambitions at home and certainly had aspirations to exert more influence generally over law creation, or what we might call jurisgenesis. So it's often described in the literature as political influence, but I would say we should reinterpret it as jurisdictional conduct to enable them to do what they wanted to do with respect to financing their ideas for a direct trade. And so in 1602, these groups unified into the VOC, the United East India Company. So as part of that dual motivation, that unified group sought to enter into a relation with the States General, themselves one of several rival jurisdictional groups vying for authority. And the way they did this, a kind of mutually supporting gesture, was to enter into a charter. So we often tell this story from the vantage point of the present, as though the charter created the company and delegated authority. But neither the state nor the company existed yet. So I can do a footnote here about the Netherlands and the United Provinces, but I'm going to just put that aside for a minute, because what I really want to tell you is that arguably it's better to think of the chartering as an active negotiation between the merchant family groups joining in one company and the men putting themselves forth as the representatives of the cities and the provinces and the representatives of the States General. And many of these men were literally related from groups of them. But like Grotius's writing, the Charter is also an excellent example of both prefiguration, in the sense that it described what it wanted to be as though it already was, and a technology of jurisdiction, in that it purported to authorize something by reference to a lawmaking authority that the document itself was calling into being. So the document purported to create a syndicate of the 6 groups of merchants and call it the VOC. It described a financial structure and committed to lasting for 21 years. It asserted that the group would offer shares and committed that group to allowing all of the residents of the United Provinces to subscribe to those shares. In turn, the document locked the investors into providing capital for 10 years. And here we can see a form of interpolation of the other people in a place into that venture through wider shareholding and a nation-building element of the Charter. And I think the paper of Ntoko and Melissa alluded to some of this. So according to Ron Harris, this particular form of long-lasting single entity with a separate existence to its shareholders is one of the earliest examples of the business corporation. The idiom of the corporation and the legal form was familiar to the drafters of the Charter because of religious and municipal corporations. And arguably, the intelligibility of an idea of uniting a group of people as one came from the Christian idea of the body of Christ, the corpus mysticum. So, according to Quentin Skinner, that innovation later fed back into state thinking. So, company before state, corporate form in company form, state, corporate form of state later. But I just want to linger for a moment in the idea of creation, because people get tangled by the language of creation, especially when they try to distinguish between legal fictions and legal artifices, and also when they think of companies as real entities being accorded recognition by the state. I hope there's at least one corporate lawyer in the audience who understands that tangle. But I think it would be better to think of legal creation as a technique by which a status is being accorded to the group being described as being created. That status will allow that group or entity to be treated as one body corporate and considered to be separate from both the creating entity and the people who form that entity, and therefore able to transact and hold privileges from the state in its own name. Today, registration and incorporation are both techniques which ascribe status in a similar way. But even today, according status is also a reciprocal affirmation of the authority of the entity according that status. The authority by which the Charter purported to create the VOC was the name of the States General of the United Netherlands. So in my argument, the authority of that entity was being produced at the same time as it was purporting to create the VOC. So I could say more about the governance structure of the VOC as well, but I won't. I'll run out of time, but I just want to notice that the board was called how do you pronounce it? Heren 17. I don't think they said 17. The 17 gentlemen who I presume met in this room, did they? Okay. So one of the most important things about the Charter from our perspective, though, is how it related to the outside of Europe. The Charter purports to grant several privileges to the VOC. First and most important was the territorial trade monopoly, which asserted that no one could sail east of the Cape of Good Hope or beyond the Straits of Magellan for the next 21 years. The Charter also said that the company could enter into commitments and draw up contracts in the name of the States General of the United Netherlands. So the company was being authorised to exercise the diplomatic functions of the nascent state outside Europe. The right of monopoly, which was purportedly applicable to all, but if it could be sustained at all, was really only vis-à-vis those within the reach of the effective jurisdiction of the United Provinces. By its charter, the VOC was also granted an ability to create institutions of law within that expanse. Oh, sorry, it goes dim when it's black. Can you still read that?
Yeah.
Okay. So in retrospect, people almost always describe that part of the Charter as a delegation of sovereign powers. But it would be better, you won't be surprised I want to tell you a different interpretation, to hold on to the idea that it was a purported authorisation of lawmaking power or jurisdiction beyond the United Provinces at the same time as these powers were being claimed by those entities entering into the Charter within Europe. These groups were literally related elites residing in the place of the group purportedly authorising all of this and doing it in the new idiom of sovereignty. Let me offer a provocation to this audience, because in my argument, we can read the Charter then as a form of constitution. Not the classic self-authorising gesture of the Constitution that begins "we the people," but and which brings the people into being at the same time as it asserts that they're making the constitution. But here, an act of co-constitution instituting the authority of one group through the act of creation of another group. So as well as this co-constitution of company and state, we need to pay attention to the fact that instituting the state is connected with the assertion of legality outside Europe, an assertion that begins with the company. The assertion at the time is itself both outrageous and indefensible. The United Provinces have no authority. They have no authority to grant the VOC an ability to do anything in the lands that they're being gestured towards. As Phil Stern, the American historian, says in relation to the English Charters of Incorporation, this was to become a common feature to make these outrageous claims. So there were several rivals. I'll give you a second to read it. So he's talking about the English charters here, but one could say the same thing about this. So there were several rivals here, of course, including the people who lived outside Europe and who had plenty of laws of their own. There were other European polities. There were armed merchants named pirates, but that's another story. But remember that this is a time when Asia is very much richer than Europe, and Europeans are still very small players in global trade. So when the charter was written, they would have meant little to those people and polities that the holders were encountering abroad. But the point is that they are prefigurative, and the techniques of jurisdiction at work in such charters get built upon by even more mundane techniques and documents and doctrines until the claims are later actualized into property and authority, often through further techniques backed up by violence, which we could think of as technologies of empire. But we need to return here to Grotius because, of course, once the VOC is chartered, Captain Van Heemskerk sets sail and soon seizes the Santa Catarina, the impelling action with which our story began. And when he develops an argument to justify that action, Grotius has to make good a bunch of claims. He has to challenge the claim of the Pope of the Portuguese to have a monopoly. This means challenging the authority of the Pope to grant such a monopoly. He does this by relegating the Pope's authority to the spiritual realm, hence the invention of religion. But to do this, he splits secular authority from spiritual authority, and he asserts that there is a secular authority compared with spiritual authority that has better jurisdiction over a certain range of things. And he does this by taking up the vernacular of natural law. This is why intellectual historians like the Australian Ian Hunter describe Grotius as a civil philosopher and natural law as a political philosophy. So this characterization of a sphere of life as religious and the concomitant invention of religion also has a prefigurative effect on the way that non-European law will continue to be relegated through the technique of ascriptive classification to the domain of non-law because it's religion. But actually, at the time, this includes non-Christian forms of life, including Judaism. Grotius also asserts the sea as without jurisdiction and thereby free. But this is another technique which becomes familiar, the technique of declaring a place as without law. Because obviously, it's not an assertion of the absence of law. It's an assertion of the authority to declare that I can say it's got no law. So in order to avoid Van Heemskerk being considered to be a pirate, Grotius also has to invoke the nation as having authorised this conduct. This is well before the birth of nationalism, of course, but the authorising language of nation was becoming available. So here he ties the asserted freedom to engage in long-distance trade together with the wealth of the Dutch and with the fortunes of the VOC. And this is a way of calling the Dutch nation into being in a particular form, building on the power of the merchants in the state of flux at home, linking them to overseas trade, wrapping it all together. And as Ileana Forrest puts it, Grotius anchored the emerging Dutch national identity to the rock of seaborne long-distance trade. So, like the Charter, which instituted the VOC by calling on the authority of the States General, thus instituting that too, Grotius Tract supports the contested claims that this group of people were legitimate rulers of the Netherlands, and through the magic of jurisdiction and prefigurative jurisprudence, writing legal things as though they were true, the company and the state are being co-formed. As Julia Adams observes, that Grotius authored both the International Maritime Doctrine of Mare Liberum and a domestic political theory that enabled the collective rule of the regents and provincial estates over both their would-be sovereign monarchs and the people was brilliantly innovative and structurally symptomatic. Okay, not nearly at the end, but at least we're at the end of part one. No, part two is much less long than part one, don't worry. Yes. We're all downhill from here, but in a good way. Okay, so if this were a book and not a lecture, or if it were a week-long intensive and not an hour-long talk, I would move forward slowly to unpack the way that what was prefigured in the 1600s was actualized later through a range of techniques, including by being interpreted as prefigurative and usually backed by force. We could ask questions together about how this actualization took place both inside and outside Europe. But I can't do that now, so I'm going to compress the point to say that in essence what I'm arguing is that it makes a difference in how we understand later periods if we think about them not as inaugural, but as built on legal techniques, or better, jurisdictional techniques, because they're also declaring what the law per se is, which are drawing on authority from earlier texts, which both prefigured and were rendered prefigurative retrospectively. This technique, and again, this came up in our conference, this technique is about reading continuity and continuous authorization into history. So much the same way as the Hebrew Bible is rendered into a Christian text by rechristening it the Old Testament and describing it as having prefigured the arrival of Christ, they both become part of one universal story rather than rival stories, in much the same way as discourses of progress or history or development work. But it makes a difference too that these are specifically prefigurations which were being conjured in the co-formation of company and state as they travelled together southward. So that movement and co-formation were generative of patterns which allowed a sharing and distribution of both domains of activity and claims to authority between company and state. This emerged through forms of status in relation to each other, through legal personhood and eventually legal personality. And as I've discussed in other texts elsewhere, the academic's favourite place, both public debt and national currency were material aspects of this joinder and movement southwards. So these distributions of authority and activity between company and state worked together to facilitate the displacement of rival laws and rival forms of life, both inside and outside Europe. And with that displacement, forms of property and their modes of protection were emplaced. So mundane techniques and doctrines, through mundane techniques and doctrines, many of the outrageous claims made in the early charters became the basis for extraction, domination, foreign ownership, later rechristened foreign investment. And as formal decolonisation was taking place, now I'm jumping forward many, many years, a major task for Anglo-American European lawyers in the 20th century was to invent techniques which ensured that those forms of relation endured after the end of formal decolonisation. So that was not a passive or smooth thing. There was lots of resistance and lots of violence. But those from the South continued to experience this displacement as forms. Can you read that, or is it too small, I think? I'll tap it. Yeah, people at the back probably can't see it. It'll remain a mystery. No. So people from the South knew knew all of this full well when they're fighting for independence. And again, the paper from Tokoso and Melissa that we heard yesterday, I think touches on this idea. So those decolonising states experienced the difficulties of trying to assert meaningful authority and autonomy in lawful terms, even as new doctrines of international law were being invented and repurposed and always described as long-standing through prefigurative reinterpretation and then reclassified and classified as public and private and national and international in ways which continued to move authority out of the grasp of states in the South, like a ball in cups at a fair, you know, that where you put the ball and you can't see it. So the struggle was gaining traction until the end of the Cold War, I would say, when the Third World debt crisis really broke its back. And I would borrow Ngugi wa Thiong'o's rules and really say that that period could be described as a brief period of interregnum between periods of corporate rule. Many of those fighting against the company state coalition, as it was being lived in the South, were assassinated or changed. And yet, even as that was happening, the West continued to assert its legal and moral authority, and the myth of a lawless South and the lawful North was reinvigorated as the Cold War ended. What this suggests is that, nearly there, what this suggests is that the way that the West maintains its equal wealth and the way that it maintains its authority are two sides of the same coin. And it's why I began by saying that the Goshen moment has a recursive temporality, or is a composite idea of both the techniques that Grotius innovated and how he was later interpreted. And why it's important to pay attention to both the fact of prefiguration and its later interpretation as part of one single universal story. So when international law is invented in the 19th century, it's not a coincidence that Grotius is the name given to a whole lot of those inventions. This is the British Institute. What became the British Institute for Comparative and International Law began life as the Grotius Society. And when Grotius is anointed as the father, the authority being traced back to his writings is grounded discursively in virtue, and that virtue is expressed as universality. But even by the 20th century, plurality had not gone away, and universalization became an explicit technique of domination, not just a discursive one. And as Adel Hassan Khan has shown us in a chapter soon to be published on the Cold War in South Asia, universality is explicitly wielded as a response to the quote-unquote problem of plurality through Rockefeller-funded legal education, global law reform projects, law and development projects. Okay, so what all of this means is that because virtue and universality have become locked together in a vice-like grip in European international legal thought, in my view, there is no robust account of plural lawful life coming from European international legal thought. So Mark Carney and his rupture of authority and its recapture by the Western Middle Powers, the rule of the little brothers, still relies for its authority on the universal claim that can't tolerate plurality. In its best guise, it offers inclusion, but that is an orientation of the powerful. So what this means for us, and perhaps for our research cluster, is that new ideas are going to have to come from the South, or thinking grounded in the experience of the South, which both think plurality and which understand that the co-formation of company and state hide the secret of Euro-American authority and its material effects. Scholars and activists from the South and solidaristic with the South are doing inspiring things with this idea. So we can think of Francesca Albanese's report on the complicity of corporate actors with the genocide in Gaza. We can think of Michael Thafri's report on global corporations and the food supply. We can think of Shah Hamori's work on military companies. We can think of the arguments before the ICJ in relation to the advisory opinion on climate change that were made by the Pacifica states, Dylan Asafo in particular, Council for Cook Islands. So there are other examples too, from older examples that we can take from the Cold War, plug to a new book forthcoming called Rival Legality by me, Gary Simpson and Matt Craven, where we are trying to recuperate imaginative strategies from that period that were generated by the South. But because so many of the leaders who were trying those experiments were assassinated, there has also been a shift in a way from political projects to scholarly ones as they are being generated from the South. But when you're looking for inspiration, I think we need to look for people who understand the co-formation of company and state and who are trying to hold on to lawful life as plurality, not as pluralism, but as encounter. So not a normative orientation that presumes a point of departure, but an idea that plurality is a fact. And what we have to do is work out ways to live lawfully and peacefully with that fact. Okay, so I will stop in time to allow time for discussion, but that hasn't been that long, has it? Okay. All right, but I just want to highlight that I've been performing certain kinds of methodological orientation and bringing to bear a certain sensibility of encounter and legal plurality as description rather than orientation. And I think this is a sensibility shared by many people in this room and with the Decolonial Futures Research Group possibly, but which is unusual in our wider discipline, my wider discipline of international law. And to give fruit to this sensibility as both a scholar and a teacher, I've crafted, applied, settled on, collaborated in developing a range of methodological approaches and attitudes, often with teachers, friends and interlocutors. So particularly the late Peter Fitzpatrick and the very much alive Sean McVeigh, but also Louisa Slava, Chris Gevers, Adil Hassan Khan, Tim Peters, Andre Dow, Caitlin Murphy, Haris Jamal, Dylan Wong, Andrea Leiter, Tim Lindgren, and all my current and former PhD students and many more collaborative thinkers too. So the only other thing I want to say, I'm just going to put up the name of the shorthand for some of these methods, but the only other thing I would want to say is because from the vantage point of Anglo-Australian international law, it has occurred to me, it has been striking to me doing this project that about company and state, that the co-formation of company and state are always obscured as part of the operation of our disciplinary practices. And so what we've had to do in our group is build a recursivity into our method, which focuses also on training and legal education as techniques themselves of transmission and authorization. So we also attend to the disciplinary routines and separations and doctrines which repattern the distribution of authority between company and state through the institution of categories like national and international, like public and private, and other forms of ascriptive classification. And in turn, we normalise these things through techniques of transmission, like the structuring the law school curriculum, including the institutionalisation of legal education and the invention of particular traditions of jurisprudence. So this understanding of international law as involved in making the world rather than coming to a world that's already made gives rise to a sense of responsibility for understanding what we're doing when we do international law, but arguably it also gives rise to a sense of possibility and to prefigure and to author and to reauthorize and rediscover and reimagine different futures. Thank you.